el gusto de em, darle la bienvenida a esta actividad que titulamos de la ciencia al impacto, dictada por el profesor Christopher Hayter. Em, Nosotros hace casi 2 meses organizamos un seminario internacional que se llama LabtoMarket, donde tuvimos de invitado al profesor Julio Pertusé de la Escuela de Ingeniería. Y a propósito de esa conversación, él nos contó que tenía invitado al profesor Hayter a venir a Chile justo en esta semana, en el contexto de su proyecto Fondesit. Y estuvimos conversando en torno a la investigación y a los proyectos que lidera el profesor Hayter de la Universidad de Georgia Tech y nos dimos cuenta que era una oportunidad súper interesante de poder generar un espacio de conversación con él, más allá de el trabajo de investigación que van a realizar durante esta semana con el profesor Pertusé. Y desde ahí empezamos a sumar actores, ¿no? Y se sumó la iniciativa Ciencia 2030, por supuesto la Dirección de Emprendimiento del Centro de Innovación, la Escuela de Ingeniería, varios actores que estamos movilizando estos temas dentro de la Universidad Católica. Quisimos organizar este espacio y por eso les damos la bienvenida a esta actividad. Y quiero dejar con ustedes para dar un saludo a nuestra vicerrectora de investigación, María Angélica Fellenberg, a quien dejo a continuación.
Muchas gracias, Nancy. Eh, Muy contenta de verlos a todos aquí. Le hice el comentario a Álvaro, le dije, parece que hay pocos profes, hay muchos estudiantes de posgrado, así que debo decirles que se ven todos muy jóvenes y muy como estudiantes de posgrado. Así que Álvaro me dijo, no, me dijo, es el perfil de los emprendedores, son así, así que lo encontré bien simpático. Así que muy contenta. Y muy contenta sobre todo porque este es un ámbito en el cual tenemos mucho que hacer. Tenemos mucho músculo que desarrollar y tenemos que avanzar en este tema. Por el lado del camino académico más tradicional, lo tenemos súper claro, pero este camino no lo tenemos tan claro y tenemos que aprender bastante a cómo hacerlo y cómo nosotros desde la universidad podemos apoyar justamente a nuestros académicos, a nuestros estudiantes de posgrado y también de pregrado a tomar a lo mejor estos caminos. Así que le doy la bienvenida al profesor Christopher Hayter, que está aquí muy contento de también de poder darnos esta charla y también aprovecho de agradecer al profesor Julio Pertusé por esta oportunidad. Siempre podemos aprender y aprender más y esta es una gran oportunidad justamente para aprender más de cómo podemos mover nuestras investigaciones, lo que nosotros desarrollamos, llevarlo justamente para generar un impacto, para estar en la sociedad, para ir al mercado y no necesariamente al mercado, también pueden ser políticas públicas, es decir, puede ser los distintos ámbitos que tiene que ver cualquier tipo de emprendimiento. Así que espero que sea una muy buena charla. Ahí yo estoy en primera fila para escucharlo y que sea una excelente jornada. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, para cumplir con las formalidades, quiero presentarles al profesor Christopher Hayter. Él es académico de la Escuela de Políticas Públicas del Instituto de Tecnología de Georgia, del Georgia Tech, de Estados Unidos. Su investigación se centra en el rol de las universidades, en los sistemas de innovación, el emprendimiento académico y las políticas de ciencia y tecnología. Ha estudiado en profundidad las trayectorias de investigadores que emprenden desde la academia, así como las condiciones institucionales y culturales que facilitan o dificultan la transferencia del conocimiento hacia la sociedad. Uno de sus enfoques más distintivos es entender el emprendimiento académico como un fenómeno psicosocial que va más allá de los modelos lineales de transferencia tecnológica, poniendo en el centro a las personas, sus redes, identidades y motivaciones. Chris Hayter ha colaborado en diversas agencias públicas de ciencia e innovación y combina una trayectoria académica con experiencia práctica como asesor y consultor en políticas públicas en temas de innovación. También ha sido investigador del National Bureau of Economic Research y ha participado en programas como iCorps de la National Science Foundation, que promueve precisamente el emprendimiento científico-tecnológico en Estados Unidos. Así que, Chris, welcome.
Buenos días. Ok, podemos conversar en español más tarde, pero creo es mejor si voy a hablar en inglés porque no quiero hacer muchos errores en mi presentación. Bueno, soy Chris, and it's great to be here. I am at Georgia Tech, or Georgia Institute of Technology. If you are not familiar with Georgia Tech, it's a very technically minded Georgia Tech. About 90% of our students are in computer science and engineering. Now I'm in the other 10%, but I study scientists and computer scientists. So I get to work with these people that are much smarter than me, but I'm a bit more social, right? So I love what I do, and I love working in places that may be similar. And I've always thought of myself as a translator. So I think if anyone knows the Big Bang Theory, right, this sort of the show with Sheldon, at least in the US, Sheldon is a very, very popular scientist or a stereotypical scientist. And so what I think of is that maybe I'm not Leonard, but I'm someone who works with people like Sheldon to tell their story. And for this presentation, really think about how they can do good in the world, right? I think our language, for the most part, has been mostly economic about how we do good in the world when it comes to technology transfer. That's at tension with the history of universities, which has been more about social. So my work as a translator is to try to figure out how you can do both, right? So I was trained as an economist, but more recently, I want to share with you a story about my journey of learning about social psychology and how it applies to Sheldon, right? So that's the purpose of the presentation. So I like to start, I'm a recovering consultant, I still consult. So I always want to start with the recommendations in advance. Why are we here? What are we trying to do? This is rhetorical, right? We won't be in the clouds too much today, a little bit, but not too much. So we as universities want to think about enabling students, not constraining them, right? We want to enable them to do good things in the world. We want to enable them to create new knowledge. We want to create new knowledge. We want to create ideas. And where I'm really focused is graduate students and postdocs, right? Why? Because they're becoming experts. They're the ones that do most of the work. How do we sort of enable them, right? The practical part. Well, we sort of give them opportunities not just to become trained as scientists, but also other types of scientists in other contexts. So business, government, nonprofits, and the like. So I really think there's an opportunity for places like your university, universities all over the world, to reframe the postdoc position, even if you don't have that many postdocs, as an innovation fellowship, in other words, an intermediary between universities and society. And I think we do this through lots of things that we're actually pretty good at. We just don't focus or blend it with science often. So how do we experiment and play? How do we work in teams? How do we work in teams with external audiences? So what are we doing here, right? I've got invited to this wonderful event by the University Technology Transfer group, right? So we're thinking about technology transfer, at least that's what we call it in practice. And so technology transfer is a bit different than how we might have thought of university and its role 50 years ago. So when we talked about R&D, we still talk this way. We think about the production of new knowledge through publication. We think about R&D as scientific training, and we also think about the social impact. Technology transfer is a bit different. About 40 or 50 years ago, we started talking about the economic impact. Now, we knew that R&D had economic impact, but we didn't talk about it as much. I'm generalizing and primarily generalizing for the US, but I think this is true. The US had a lot of influence on technology transfer in other places. And so in 2013, I was still a consultant, but I loved to work with graduate students. And I worked with a gentleman by the name of Al Link, who was on my dissertation committee. We did a review of the nerd work, right? The literature of how scholars really viewed technology transfer. And what we found, we reviewed 150 publications, and then we interviewed sort of practitioners. In both audiences, we found that they had a fairly linear view of technology transfer. It began as a scientist, right? Sheldon is in his lab. He could discover something. He writes about it. He discloses it to the technology transfer office. The technology transfer office says, this is good. We need to patent this. We need to protect it. And then we license it to a large company or maybe even a spin out because that technology was not yet ready, right? And from that, we start using, this is very common in Europe, this sort of lexicon about the third mission, right? Research, teaching, technology transfer, economic development. More recently in the academic circles, we call that the entrepreneurial university, right? You might have even heard this before. It's very popular with university presidents. My university president uses Georgia Tech's an entrepreneurial university. We have the most spin-offs in the United States. Really? Wow, okay, interesting. So if we want to improve the linear model, what do? Well, we need more inputs. We need more R&D, right? We need more disclosures. Maybe we hire more people for the Office of Technology Transfer. Excuse me, I'm good. Let's go. All right, happens all the time. I'm used to it. How do we create programming for startups or spinoffs, right? Most importantly, in this sort of discussion about improvement, we need more funding. Let's create a venture fund. I've worked all around the world. Everyone wants a venture fund. It's the thing. We're joining society, right? We're going to create a venture fund. There's some challenges with this model, right? There's a few challenges. The first of which is treated separately from the other missions of the university. Where's teaching, right? In this sort of linear model that's patent-centric. Wait, patents? Does that exist? Are we supposed to be giving knowledge to the world? Why are we patenting it? And it often overlooks opportunities for bringing these missions together, right? Innovation is not linear. Just ask IBM, right? Ask Kodak, that doesn't even exist anymore. Really famous American company, it doesn't exist. They had a very linear view of innovation. Oh, why would you use digital technology for photos, right? Why? We love film. We want to develop better film. It also requires long periods of time. I'll tell you about a project we worked on autonomous vehicles. The seeds of autonomous vehicles in the US were planted in the late 1950s. It's only today in Atlanta that you see autonomous vehicles. Pretty weird, right? Cars without drivers. Those patents and startups we talked about, they're actually pretty poor measures of innovation, right? They're proxies, they're useful, but they actually don't tell us the whole story. Especially, as I mentioned, who does the work? A patent will not tell you, it'll sort of list inventors, but who did all the work before the patent? What ideas are these based on? Yeah, of course, citations. But in general, we don't know all the people who are involved in that. And so my goal has been as a researcher, as a consultant, is to sort of understand these things better. What is really happening that's not linear, right? And then what should we be doing about it? The policy aspect, the practical aspect. And so pretty simple, as I mentioned before, right? Academic entrepreneurship, which I tend to use. Why do I use academic entrepreneurship instead of technology transfer? Is for me, it's also about the person. It's enabling someone to be better, to be agentic, right? To have power for themselves and do good in the world. It's not only about the university. It's not only about a patent. Excuse me. Can you understand? Okay, I'm not going too fast. Okay, so, and can someone give me, like when it's been maybe 25 minutes, just let me know. Okay. So how about me? How did my journey begin? So I grew up in North Carolina, so East Coast, the United States. It's in the middle. I tell people not from the US between Disney World and New York. There's like some lands and states in there. And so I grew up on a farm there. I left home when I was 17, was an exchange student in what was then Czechoslovakia. I came back, went to the Coast Guard Academy. I was in our military. I say military because it's a civilian service. 4 years active duty, 10 years in reserves. I left the coast. When I left full-time duty, I worked for a private equity company in the hospitality industry. It was a great training about investment. And then kind of got bored. And then I moved to DC and was a bartender. And then I don't know if, I'm sure they have this in Chile, I was a temporary worker, a temp. So I ended up temping for this guy by the name of Jim Miller. And Jim had been in the Reagan administration as the director of Federal Trade Commission. And Jim was an economist. I was like, this economic stuff is kind of cool, especially with antitrust, because it's really the confluence of law and economics. And so that got me into consulting. And then in the process, I decided to make the very smart decision of enrolling in a doctoral program. Because, you know, if you're working 80 hours a week, why not pile on some more responsibility, right? But I met this gentleman, Nick Vinortis. He's Greek, but he's at George Washington University. Nick was one of the first people, at least in the US, to study sort of joint ventures between universities and with universities and companies, right? And the other thing I would do is go to academic conferences. So not as a contributor, but as a consumer. I was a consultant. I want to understand what these people are researching. So I go to places like San Sebastian, Spain. Really nice, right? When it's not raining. This is a beautiful spot. So this gentleman to my right is David Aldrich. David will probably win the Nobel Prize one day for entrepreneurship. So David was on my dissertation committee. I don't know how that happened. This gentleman is Al Link. So Al is editor of the Journal of Technology Transfer, right? This is Maribel Guerrero. Maribel is probably the incoming editor. This is Sherry Bresnitz. She's an economic geographer. But as you get to know these three gentlemen, and the ladies of two, but you know, Sherry and Maribel are my age, you sort of understand not just their professional contributions, but sort of the timing of their own career. And so they were coming up in the 1980s. They were faculty in the 1990s. And there was this orthodoxy, right? These sort of ideas they were kind of fighting against, right? To make their own contributions. We all have that, right? We all sort of have to change against the new generation, or the old generation, sorry. So what were they sort of fighting against? Well, this idea that resources, financial resources, remember the fund, right, are the primary determinant, right? When I say primary, almost only. Sometimes people only talk about, well, I have a startup, I need to raise money, right? Okay, but great. What about the other stuff that you're supposed to do, right? So they're fighting against this, right? Knowledge spills over effortlessly. You hear this in the US too. Let's fund basic science. Not how, let's just fund it, right? Because if we fund knowledge, remember the linear system, it will result in impact. Innovation depends on the internalization of spillovers. This is a little bit geek language, but it basically means large companies fund most of the R&D along with universities. So therefore, large companies like Kodak are the best innovation, right? No, right? And then entrepreneurs are solely motivated by profits. We know all these things can be true, right? But they're not always true. And so that's where they focused their research a generation ahead of me. And so I used what they learned. You don't need to know the details of the knowledge spillover theory of entrepreneurship, but this is what I used for my dissertation that I finished in 2010. And so when I started as a faculty member in 2014, I left consulting. I was left with this sort of thought, where do I start? What are my contributions? And the cool thing is I was actually recruited to be a tenure track professor, but I was recruited because I had experience. It's very rare in the US to have an academic position where we want you to have experience, right? So I was really lucky, and I'm really grateful for that. And yes, I moved to the desert, you know, sort of, I was just in Atacama, beautiful, but you all don't have these cactuses, I don't think, the Saguaro. but it really was a wonderful experience because I went into the position with data. And so what motivates Sheldon? It's data, right? It's sort of understanding and observing things. And so that's really important as an assistant professor because it's what you publish. So I went in with a ton of data I was able to publish, but then I was at mid-tenure review. So in the US system, after 3 years, they say, okay, we're going to keep you or not. How have you done? So my mid-tenure review, because I had this data that I'd published, it went well. Thumbs up, yay, right? And then you go on to go up for tenure. But the other thing it allows you to do is think of, like, sort of say, okay, now I can get away from this data I've collected and start thinking about new projects. Cool. Well, what do I want to focus on? Well, I have this friend, and she's a postdoc in my university. And so she was just telling me stories. So true fact, in the United States, and this is a complicated sort of statistic, but on average, 90% of university postdocs, which by the way is training for an academic career, do not get academic jobs, right? It's like, if anyone knows American Idol, maybe Chile has a equivalent, like a music competition. It's like a music competition. It's like the World Cup, right? Only one or two teams can make it to the final of the World Cup, right? It's the same thing with academic careers. It's crazy. So we started a project and we asked, well, what happens to these individuals? And one of the things we noticed interviewing is a relatively small sample, but postdocs all over the United States, is many of them were talking about this crisis, this personal grave consequence, existential crisis they were going through when they were realized that they couldn't become academics. We'll come back to that. Second, we have in my very gracious introduction, we talked about the I-Corps program, right? The funny thing about the I-Corps program is it's basically a program that says, you all, do you have some ideas for technology? Okay, cool. Take that idea and go interview people to see if it has value, right? That's called customer discovery. It's not very resource intensive. It's actually, as American government programs go, quite cheap. But a lot of people do this and then they drop out, right? Like, wow, that was really hard. Or people that sort of continue, their mind changes. They all of a sudden start thinking differently about their venture and what entrepreneurship means. And so I actually had the opportunity to be an evaluation lead. How does this program work for the Northeastern hub, which is based in MIT, right? We'll come back to that. Third, this is my third project. Yeah, I was busy, right? I was anxious to get a lot of new projects going. I had an undergraduate independent study. So this gentleman on the right is named Andrew Hannes. He's a good friend of mine and a former undergraduate student. Andrew's a veteran. He'd been in Afghanistan and Iraq. And during that time, he'd heard about these robot races in the desert. If you've ever heard of DARPA, maybe not, but basically it's part of our Department of Defense. Their job is to fund advanced research projects. And you might have heard of things called the internet or stealth technology or robotics. DARPA planted the seeds, at least in the US context. There were other projects all over the world, but they played a really, really important role in our history of innovation. So they had these races of robots in the mid-2000s that we know, sort of anecdotally, that they accelerated technology transfer. But the thing we became really interested in were 18 teams that had no entrepreneurship experience and no robotics experience and somehow participated and then started companies. What? Like, how did that happen? That was our starting premise. By the way, this is Red Whitaker. He's sort of known as the father of robotics, at least in the US. This is at Carnegie Mellon. And this was their entry. I'll come to some other examples in a minute, but this was their entry into the DARPA Grand Challenges. It looked pretty sophisticated, right? Maybe not the most modern, but at least for 2004, 2005. Well, that's pretty interesting. What I realized in all three of these is I didn't have the tools as an economist to tell this story, to tell these stories. Whoa, how in the world do you talk about existential crises, right? Literally, these people could use therapy. I did not have that training. So that brought me to social psychology, right? Then met some friends, listened to some lectures. So I became really interested in social psychology. What is social psychology? Sorry, the academic definition. The effect of other people and stimuli. A stimuli could be an earthquake, right? A hurricane, a tsunami, a natural event, losing a loved one. That's an example of an event. And that's effects on our feelings, thoughts, and importantly for us, behaviors. And in psychology, right, psycho, social, it's the ABCs, the affect, how we feel, behavior, what we do, and then cognition, how we think. And that sort of is blended with the social, right? It's a function of our networks, like who we know, who we interact with, or what we interact with. And basically, what I love about social psychology, it's multi-level, right? How we think and feel has an effect on the organizations or the institutions we're part of, just as the institutions and organizations we're part of have a almost daily have an impact on how we think and feel. Think politics, right? So this can be in many different contexts. There's many concepts in social psychology. My favorite for now is identity. And I'm probably going to be spending the next 10 years of my career focused on identity as it relates to entrepreneurship. And identity is this self-referential response to who am I? Who am I as a professor? Who am I as a brother, as a son, as a Chilean wine drinker, right? Who are we? Well, we are affiliated with a university. We might be football fans, right? I'm the only one, well, there are only a few of us are wearing brown, right? We wear dark clothes, right? And this is what I really like about identity. It's enacted, who we are is enacted by how we talk about ourselves, right? How we dress, right? Maybe I'm wearing brown because, well, I'm already blonde, so I'm not, I know there's blonde people in Chile, but not a lot, right? Or I haven't seen a lot. Symbols, so how we dress, and then practices, what we do, how do we teach? How do we give a presentation? These are all reflections of who we are, right? Another important thing is the idea of a prototype. A prototype, not necessarily in the entrepreneurial sense, but in the cognitive sense. What does it mean to be a good brother? Well, my brother and I talk once a week, right? We might send each other jokes, talk about sports. What does it mean to be a good professor? What does it mean to be a good entrepreneur, right? And it helps determine what's legitimate. This is a social construct. This can change, right? What it means to be a good partner, a good spouse today, probably a little different than it was in my parents' generation, right? And the most important piece is like those organizations or institutions we're part of can constrain or can really enable those dynamics, right? So this sort of social psychology identity really changed the way I think about entrepreneurship. 2022, really hard. We published a paper after 3 attempts in other journals, in a journal actually called Small Business Economics, right? And so we use social psychology to explain entrepreneurship. I read it today and I'm like, it's okay. But it was a reflection of my learning, right? It was a reflection of this journey from economics to social psychology. So let's go back, right? Let's go back to trying to tell those stories of where I began, right? How that sort of influenced me on this journey of social psychology and identity. So if you're framing the postdoc journey in terms of identity, we could think of the doctorate as sort of an indoctrination, right? It's introducing someone to a scientific identity, and importantly, an academic scientific identity, right? And if that's true, then what's the postdoc? The postdoc, you're doubling down, right? We're going to American Idol. We're going for the World Cup. We're going to win. Are you going to win? Not in academia, right? You're having this training. You're doubling down. There's no jobs. Guess what? You can't go to the World Cup. You lost in the first round, right? 90%. Crazy. And worst part, remember social psychology, 2 levels, organizational level, institutions, faculty, generally, right? And universities do not make it easy. They actually constrain the development of alternatives, right? Well, we're a really good soccer player, football player. You could be a coach in a college. No. We want you to focus on the World Cup, even though you're not going to the World Cup, right? That's what's happening. But here's the weird part. Remember what I told you, most postdocs, again, in the US, I think this is true in Europe, maybe true here, maybe not. These individuals are doing most of this entrepreneurship work. They're also the experts in the science. The bad part, they drop out. They don't drop out of the postdoc position, they drop out of science. In identity, this is called an identity exit, right? The problem is not just that we don't, from a public sector standpoint, we've invested in these individuals, right? And now those investments have left the building, right? But they're actually worse off. Physical and emotional consequences for these individuals. And that's, to me, that's primary, right? These are our friends, they're smart people, they're members of our community, and we've lost momentum and innovation. So when it comes to a practical policy solution, I'm working on this, not just me, others. How do we align that job market reality with the realities of innovation and what they're doing, right? There's a lot of ways to do that, but this is my impetus, right? This is why I'm interested. I didn't think we would end up here, which is the wonderful thing about being a researcher, but it's the case. What about I-Corps, right? If you're looking at it from sort of an empirical standpoint, we know individuals learn about entrepreneurship. We know they learn about the difficulty of entrepreneurship. This is not, well, we're going to raise venture capital, go to market, and we're going to do it in 6 months. This stuff's hard, right? It's hard to talk to people, right? If you frame it in terms of identity, like the postdocs, right, existential crisis, they themselves are also experiencing a crisis, but it's short and it's managed and it's in a few weeks. And so many individuals we thought were dropping out, come back to that, or they're committing. But actually, when many of them were dropping out, they would come back. So they just needed a break. These people are crazy. They were telling me what I had was worthless. This is my love and joy. And then people think about it, they make sense of it. Oh, you know what? They were right. It's like, I'm a smart guy, but I just need to talk their language, right? And they're learning about this. It's human. So they were really exploring about these things. The other thing that's been really cool about the I-Corps program, about studying it from an identity standpoint, many people enter into entrepreneurship in the academic context through different doorways, right? Or different gateways. Technology transfer, they have a professor who's an entrepreneur, they go to an incubator. What we found is if you do this first, right? If you do this first and you have some guidance or mentoring, then you actually make better use of the other resources. Why? Because you understand how long it takes. Give me the funding. I'm going to really, really spin this well and think about how to do that. So it really sort of provides a really nice opportunity for a quick exploration. But in the US context, it has a big problem. In our context, there's no mentoring, right? So in other words, they have the day-to-day task of what they're doing these interviews. They don't have anyone that helps them understand the big picture, right? This is what it means for your career. This is what it means for your venture. How are you doing today? No one's doing that. And so that we're working on this too. But that's one of the biggest challenges with I-Corps. It's not perfect at all, but you need this sort of dual track of instruction and mentoring at the same time. Finally, DARPA Grand Challenges. This was so awesome. Andrew and I are buddies because he got me really hooked into this. So you have these races where you have these vehicles that you might see on the road. I mean, they have these sort of funny, sensors. This is actually a LiDAR. Today they're spinning. So this is, again, 20 years ago. But then you have these guys, right? The first two races were about 250 kilometers long. Guess what? These guys can't make it 250 kilometers. So what were the teams doing? You competed, right? You said you're going to go to the World Cup. Why did you make something that couldn't go 250 kilometers? I mean, these guys can go maybe 50 kilometers, right? So what was going on? Second, in 2005, this team from Stanford, led by Sebastian Thun, Google Street View, he came up with that, right? He and his team. He also started Google Waymo, which is the #1 leading company, at least in the US today. Sponsored by Volkswagen and Google, Android, right? They were the big giants. So this was what these guys were up against, or people like this. You saw Red Whitaker from Carnegie Mellon. These were the two dominant titans, right? So what was going on? How did those low resource teams without experience, teams without entrepreneurship experience, robotics experience, and budgets of $10,000, not $3 million, $5 million. Carnegie Mellon on the second race spent $20 million, and they had $10,000. What the heck was going on? right? Well, first of all, we know that they learned. They didn't have any robotics experience, but they were smart, right? They weren't Sheldon smart, but they were pump engineers, automotive mechanics. They were tinkerers. Some of them had semiconductor design experience. So how did they learn? Well, they read the academic publications because those are really useful when building a robot. No, right? Where were those publications from? Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon. But what was more importantly is they built robotics kits. They bought these components and they started playing with them. They started experimenting with them, right? And they blended that expertise with the robotics knowledge and created something new. Great story, a high school team, right? Of 3 guys participated in this. They didn't do well, right? They all did well professionally. All of them got amazing jobs and came up as they have patents to their name. Just incredible, right? You have all these people who aren't roboticists who came up with robotics innovations because they focused on components. They didn't focus on the architecture. They were actually focused on a piece of the robot, right? That's how they were able to survive. The fun part, right, was this sort of David and Goliath story, right? You saw Red Whitaker, you saw Sebastian Toon. You have this notion of negative identification. Maybe the US plays this role sometimes, right? Maybe it's Brazil in football. We hate them, right? Right? That's powerful, right? And that's exactly what was motivating these folks to build robots and robot components. Robots didn't do very well, but man, their components did, to the point they were actually able to start a company. The most famous example is Velodyne. So all those spinning, you've probably seen photos anyway, of like LiDAR that spin. Velodyne, they've had some problems recently, but they were a participant. The Velodyne group were stereo makers. Remember old school stereos? Maybe you've seen these in movies. Like they had turntables. What if we use a turntable idea to put these linear lasers on? Pretty cool, right? We could start a company off of that. Started here. Just for fun, not related to the impact. This is my COVID project, as I tell people. Interviewed 350 people, all on Zoom, right? It's COVID, Zoom, photos, right? You're on Zoom. There's photos of, this is 15 years later, and there's photos of their teams, right? This is their home office. And so people, we noticed later, 50 to 70 of our interviews would anthropomorphize. They were giving sort of human characteristics to inanimate objects. Example, I sat in her and I cried because I would never see her again. No, he's not talking about his girlfriend who just left him. He's talking about his robot that his team had to sell to pay their bills, right? The funny part, here's another funny part. We went back to them, like, did you guys know you were saying this stuff? No, we didn't say that. They're engineers, right? No, we would never do that. We make things. We don't do that sort of girly, feminine stuff about talking about our. So it's funny. So I don't know how we're going to write this up, but that's my big picture lesson is the power of teams and cohorts and experimentation, right? A lot of times, if you can have a shared goal, you can focus on a solution, you're going to really, really enrich the educational experience and maybe even come up with a new industry, right? Now, the really, really important part of this, and this is the part that policymakers don't want to hear, the DARPA Grand Challenges were preceded, I mentioned it, 40 years of robotics investments. The DARPA Grand Challenges would have never happened without all that other research that had taken 4 decades to do, to the point where there was this latency, right? That's the part that nobody wants to hear because that's costly, right? That you have to be patient for that. What does this mean? I'm almost done. All right, research universities must evolve beyond the traditional notion, this linear patent-centric notion of technology transfer, right? Where we're really thinking about not constraining knowledge flows because of patents, right? Patents are important. Like we need that. We need venture funds. We need all these things, but we need to think more broadly, more inclusively about innovation, social psychology. I've learned a lot. I think a lot of people will too. If we put economics together with frameworks like social psychology, for example, why do scientists become interested? Why do they drop out? Why do they continue? Research question, how do scientists develop this? Like, how do we actually think about this from a policy perspective or as a university perspective within how do we design those innovations? And then more importantly, how do we sort of understand if they're working or not? Like the whole science around evaluation and understanding this is dominated by economists. So we don't know how to sort of say, well, we put all these identity development sort of things into place, but are they working? I don't know, right? Got some patents. So, and we have to really align and integrate this with our primary social missions of research and teaching. And I often laugh, I often tell this to my colleagues. It's like, you guys remember that we are in an educational institution, right? Yeah. But that's what those professors do. Guess how many students and professors here are relative to you all? A lot more than you all, right? This is Georgia Tech. Okay, back to recommendations. This is the last slide. Good place to start. Again, just repeating. So latent opportunities for non-academic opportunities. I don't see them as exclusive. I see them as integrated. Funny, another thing we learned in the I-Corps program, guess what happens to their opportunities for those rare chances to go to the World Cup, i.e. get a tenure track position? They increase, right? You actually have a better chance of becoming a professor today in Europe, probably here, definitely in the US, if you've started a company, if you know how to talk the language of different audiences. Why? Because you can raise research funds from them, right? It's not just the government. You're actually increasing the pie or the opportunity to do other things, right? It's amazing. But remember that the mentoring networks, we have to diversify the training of scientists. It can't only be faculty mentors. We need people from government, from nonprofits, from communities. And how do we get them interacting to create value, co-create value, right? Remember what I said about postdocs next with the innovation fellowship, creating those opportunities to network externally to the US. I didn't talk a lot about faculty except negatively. I'm a faculty, right? So I don't hate my colleagues, but they do play a crucial role, right? They play a crucial role as role models, of course, entrepreneurs, but also mentors, as people that can enable their students to do other things. Don't be selfish, right? Understand that this is their future and their career, right? Consultants, mentors, advocates, stay out of the way, right? At best, mentor, be dynamic. And then more importantly, I would say, especially in university context, because we are still, faculty governance is changing, but like what could be? How can we make these things work together? And that's crucial. Happy to go in depth however you'd like. Thank you.
Gracias, Chris. Muchas gracias. Tenemos unas 25 minutos para que conversemos. Si quieren hacer preguntas, yo creo que las ideas que nos presentó Chris son bien interesantes y provocadoras, sobre todo para los que estamos trabajando en los temas de transferencia tecnológica. Así que bienvenido. Tenemos un par de micrófonos ahí disponibles. Y atentos a las preguntas. También saludo al profesor Julio Pertusé, que gracias a él y su Fondesit es que tenemos a Chris aquí. Así que muchas gracias. ¿Quién quiere partir? Por allá. You want your microphone? Sure.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Very inspirational. I switch to Spanish. ¿Es okay for you? Okay. Voy a tratar de hablar lento. Chris vivió en Colombia y habla bien español, pero no chileno. Entonces, si lo hacemos en español, debemos hacerlo bien. Quería preguntarte sobre incentivos. Los académicos tienen muchos incentivos para la investigación y mucho tiempo dedicado a la investigación. Las universidades queremos que se dediquen a temas de innovación, pero para eso también requieren ciertos incentivos. Entonces, quisiera tu reflexión acerca de los incentivos para académicos para vincularse a estas materias.
Yeah, and sorry, I hope it's okay if I
okay.
Respond in Spanish. But your question is about the primary incentives with research versus innovation, that sometimes they're different. This is actually a big challenge in the US. So take, until January, I had a very good consulting situation with our National Institutes of Health. And I still do a lot of work in the I-Corps program, which is sponsored by our National Science Foundation. So in both agencies, just changing a bit in these months, but in both agencies, there's sort of separate directorates for innovation and there's separate directorates for research. One of the challenges is they don't talk to each other. Ironically, in the current political environment in the US, the ones that are primarily focused on innovation are actually surviving quite well. It's the primary research ones that aren't. If you, hopefully you listen to sort of the research history of autonomous vehicles and robotics. So we need both. But so I often think in the conversations, the reason I've been, for example, the National Institutes of Health is about timing, right? It's about, yes, we need this research. We need to have this foundation of knowledge, but is there a way to accelerate it? And so for me, what we were working on is just this. How do you sort of take joint grants that are basic in nature, very focused on the faculty research on the students, but then involve individuals from government industry very early, not necessarily for commercialization, but in applied research, right? And so I think that that notion of partnerships that are inclusive, right, that really focus primarily on basic research, but then start to build in that as part of, for graduate students, part of the training process and the like is really important. I think it's easier at a place like Chile, it's smaller. Like Corfu could do this quite probably much easier than the National Science Foundation. And you see this in other countries. I don't know the benchmarking countries of Chile, but certainly see this in Belgium, the Netherlands, Northern European countries just really well, and they've been doing it for 40 years, right? So to me, that's sort of the future, ironically, where we need to go, especially given the politics. Second thing is at the institutional level, because I think that there are ways to sort of cross these gaps at the institutions. And, as an example, so we at Georgia Tech, there's another school in Atlanta called Emory that has a medical school. So we have a joint bioengineering program. What's interesting about the program is that students want to go to Georgia Tech first. And the reason they want to go to Georgia Tech for that is because all of our students are sponsored by medical device companies, right? So we have these industrial partnerships, and so they have both. They can go in academia, they can go into industrial jobs, but that's a function of the degree, right? So I think that even that is sort of something that an institution or multiple institutions can do that really make a difference.
No? Yes, thank you. I believe my main question is regarding the fact that what I took from the whole presentation is the fact that we're missing communication. That's the main thing. And I believe this is a problem in the academic and also in the work environment. The new generations, what they're asking, for example, now with Gen Z, the main thing that they're asking is mental health and balance between work life and personal life. And even in academic, nobody's doing the exercise. I'm a product design engineer, and the base is user experience. What do people need? What do people want? Nobody's making that question. What do academics or new academics, like the people that are doing master degrees or postgraduates, do they need to actually develop new ideas? Nobody's making those questions. I believe the main problem that we have in every country, this I believe it's a global problem, is that the new generations that are coming to the work field are staying in a commodity of like, okay, I made it. We all get taught that you need to learn and get a degree and then get to work and then you stay there. And nobody's like trying to make the question of like, what can I do that is positive, a positive impact for the new generations that are coming to the work field, and how are we trying to provide the new tools, the new environments that they need to keep on growing, because the technology is getting like way too faster and we are not answering as humans to it. I believe that's the main problem. So for me, I'm going to, my proposition for the problem that you're like promoting is that we're not replying with enough spaces for communication like this kind of situations to happen that include every kind of aspects of different students, researchers, companies, etc. Even in this situation, I believe that probably I'm not from this university. I'm from Santa Maria, another university, and I have a master's degree in another space. But probably most of the people that are here are from this university. And that's a problem. Why are we not reaching more people from different fields?
Couldn't agree more. The gentlemanly suggestion I would have in building on what you just said is focusing on a solution, right? Because we can talk about a lot. I am not a prototypical professor, right? And so I think by, the DARPA Grand Challenge is one of the things I love about them. And there's many other examples, but this was a big one, right? But there's a lot of small examples of but just sort of focusing on a very simple problem, right? How do we make sure that trash cans don't overflow after lunch, right? And is there a way to do this without hiring a whole bunch of more people, because we only need them for that 1 hour, right? So I think we all know what's going on in politics in the world, right? It's not just the US, but there's a lot of changes. And for me, science is but one of many institutions that evolved after World War II. In the US, we were, no competitors. We had 12% economic growth, right? This was not a reality in the context of 1,000 years, right? But we developed all these institutions for that time. It doesn't mean what's happening is great or right, but it is a reaction, right, to these institutions that need to change, including universities, including science. And that's the way I think about it. But the way, and change is hard. So for me, it's, okay, yes, it's communication, but it's really, and I know you meant this more broadly, but it's really, how are we going to do this, and how are we in the process change our institutions? I mean, in reality, we need to get rid of the postdoc position and rethink how we do science, right? And that was the nature of the question earlier. That's hard, and especially when there's entrenched interest. You mentioned earlier generations. But I do think, at least from my standpoint, I would go crazy if I have to wait 40 years. So for me, it's really those micro projects, and then having thoughtful conversations about making those systemic changes in the process. And that's the great thing about academia, is you can do that. You can do that, but it's, you just have to do it.
Hi, Chris. I'm Hector. I'm one of the in-house social psychologists, so I'm very pleased to see you, your talk. Yeah, and in the social sciences, we have kind of the opposite problem. The research is oriented to social impact, is mission-oriented, is identity-based. However, we do have a really hard time trying to understand how to scale up the things we do, how to make them sustainable from an economic point of view. I think that we don't even do a good job like teaching our students how to make the great solutions they have for social problems, something you can actually do in the real world, in which you need resources, money. So what are your thoughts on the social science and maybe the humanities and the arts facing this problem?
Great question. In fact, this morning, I think it was New York Times, I was reading an article about changes in Silicon Valley, right, with AI. And it was, one of the quotes was, beware if you have a degree in social sciences and humanities, which was not the case when you were talking about user interface. But now it's really kind of an arms race on technology, like who can develop these algorithms that are better But like, I think there's a lot of, sort of my personal response has been to join, if you can't beat them, join them, right? So for me, when I think about public policy and what it means, before I left Arizona State, I've taught the capstone course for 10 years. I was a consultant. I want students to sort of interact with external audiences. But as we evolved, there's a lot of other people out there where the social scientists can actually be the core of a team that solves problems, right? Sheldon is probably not very good at leading a team, right? You need the Sheldon, but you don't want him to lead the team. And Sheldon would want to lead the team. So how do you actually manage him? So I think there's all these soft skills and things that are really critical to the venture of solving social problems, or any problem. And all problems are social, all problems are economic, right? That's another false dichotomy that's our fault, right? It's fault of the economists. But that's why I use entrepreneurship. A lot of people interpret entrepreneurship. This has changed the US. I think 30 years ago, entrepreneurship was seen only as a for-profit venture. Now people know social entrepreneurs, social ventures. And so for me, how do you blend those two? And so we focused in our capstone on homelessness. It's a big problem in the western part of the US, right? Maybe a problem here too, I don't know. But certainly a huge problem in the US with technology. Well, how would you do that? Well, most homelessness in the US is not permanent, right? It's usually transition. So you have a mother with 2 daughters who is a victim of abuse, right? She lives in a city like Phoenix, where I used to live, and she's from Chicago, so she doesn't have any family. So she has to get out of a home situation. What's the number one thing you need? You have some money, you have a car, right? You leave. What do you need first? Well, you probably need a safe place to do laundry. You need a safe place to take a shower. You need a safe place to talk through these things. Guess what? An app can do that, right? There's services out there that do that. So we actually created a class called Coding for the Social Good. My students know nothing about coding, but we sort of gave them enough of a, there's everyone knows Swift. So it's the app coding language from Apple. It's great. It's built for 8th graders. Like if you have kids, go look up Swift. It's amazing. Like I can use it. So, but you introduce them to these sort of basic coding paradigms so they can talk with engineers. But they need a basic level of knowledge to do that. But it's my students, right, the public policy ones, that are the best at understanding the problems and going out and talking with those victims, right? So for me, it's sort of, which is exactly what we're talking about with innovation. How do we sort of create these teams that are solution oriented? And it could be economic, right, too. But I think showing those values, especially in the context of the venture, is really important. And that stuff, it means that we have to learn different languages, as I'm trying to learn your language, right? How much economics do you know? You probably don't want to know a whole lot, but right. But to know this, Andrew and I had to learn a lot about robotics. It's actually pretty easy, pretty fun, right? But that's what we have. We have to sort of break down those barriers of communication and sort of really think about that in practical ways.
Hi. Hi, Chris. Very nice talk. Thanks for the talk. My name is Felipe. I'm a faculty member of the physics department, but I'm also part of the initiative Ciencia 2030 program. So my question is from the faculty side. So as you are completely aware, that the faculty members must deal with 2 main duties, which are teaching and publish or perish, basically. So is there a way that the institution could help us to look forward to another things rather than being only publish and perish sometimes, and also the teaching duties? So how could the institution could evolve to something that is mixed on that?
Yeah, great question. Something I've thought a lot about. So how do we, if we're talking sort of venture based, right? Sort of the student level, maybe the team level. How do we think about the enterprise of the university itself? My biggest frustration, right? It's not endless conversations about things in the clouds, right? My biggest frustration in the university is the lack of a team culture. And when I say team, a true team, right? Like an egalitarian team, not I'm the chief of my lab and I have, MIT, 100 postdocs, and this is my fiefdom, right? It's a sort of feudal system today, right? But if we're thinking about a multidisciplinary functional team, we need a third player, right? We need some type of utility player in the departmental context. I mean, we need to sort of rethink everything, right? But we need other people who are really good. And I think where I would start, I think we could talk about this for an hour, but where I'd start, I would actually start in the space with intermediaries, right? And so technology transfer offices play that, but they played in a very sort of narrow role that could be broadened, right? And so for me, it's two things. And weirdly, we actually had this in the US for a long time called our agricultural extension program. So if I would do anything in the US, like today, right? Please, President Trump, listen to me, right? You're amazing. Apparently that's, the diplomatic way to deal with him. Then I would bring back and renovate what's called the agriculture extension program for universities. And what it was every county, thousands of counties in the US, every region in the US had one person. And the job of that person was get to know farmers, right? This is in agriculture, get to know their problems, get to know what they needed, and feed that into the university. The university, basically, faculty would have like, oh, here's this portfolio of problems that we can address, and we focus on scale, right? There was government funding, the research universities are involved, and I would go beyond agriculture. Let's do that in 5 different ways, right? But the point is there was this person whose job, maybe it's an AI bot, right? But there's an intermediary between these groups where you could understand and scale. The scale piece is what's most important because, it's just you and me, right? It's me and Julio, right? It's just us doing our little research programs. The successes are when you can scale those, which is understanding the problem and then understanding how these solutions connect. The semiconductor industry actually does this really well, right? They have a roadmap, right? If you're studying at Berkeley or Stanford or other places, semiconductors, you know exactly where your research fits into that. It's easy to do because it's, there's a architecture, right? It's harder to do in other things. But so that's where I would start, is having these sort of intermediaries. But that goes beyond one university. I think one university could do it. University of California, San Diego does this really well, but they do it with corporate funding. But yeah, I mean, that's what's missing right now, which is also where I think like postdocs could plug in, that innovation fellowship. Like they could play that role, but it would need to be organized at a programmatic university level. One idea of many.
Thank you so much. It was an amazing talk. And funny enough, just last weekend, I was talking with my group of friends. We have I am from the science side. We have someone that sits in the cinema side, laws. And we were talking just about this thing, this loss of interest in every field. And they got to know that I myself barely dropped out from the university because in some point I knew I had learned something, but I wasn't feeling like I was able to go and do something valuable. So I started going to these talks and everything. And the thing is, now I see that it's not from the science side. Even people at engineering, which in Chile, you think well, an engineer is going to have a job pretty easily. And maybe it is sometimes, but it's not the general case. And you find this pattern where young people with a lot of ideas go through university and find to the end of that with less ideas, like they become fearful of their own ideas. So I'm really interested how to tackle the generalized crisis, but from the student standpoint. Like I got to know and to talk about with some people, very intelligent people that motivated me. So I would love to know how to tackle from the really entry people in the university, like how to make them motivated so they can share an idea. It might sound like a silly idea, but the process of talking with someone who knows maybe create something bigger.
Yes, thank you for your question. I go back to the question about what the university can do. One of the things I'm doing in my department, right, is I'm kind of starting with the end first. And so I mentioned that I teach the capstone. So this year it's a year-long course. It's a lot, but we're completely renovating this capstone. And what we're doing is for social audiences. We're creating, based off this sort of customer discovery model, we're doing two things. One, we're going to do short sprints. So they're going to start with things like what I told you, like how do you, at lunchtime, how do you not have trash overflows? And then you work up to external clients. So that's very different than the way it was taught last year. So the way it was taught last year is you have one client, you work for 1 year on it, you do a literature review the first semester. It was like, no. You're going to learn this basic methodology, and you're going to do sprints, and you're going to be under pressure, right? Because that's life, right? The challenge, right, this is on me, is we have to renovate our entire curriculum to support the skills that students need to do exactly that, right? So when they're coming into this class, they should already have things like networking. How do you talk to non-academic audiences? What are some basic economic theories that underline some of these things, right? How do you do not just an academic literature review? How do you understand what's out there in a policy perspective, right? How do business people, or government people to sort of think about this? So that's incumbent on us, and again, what university can do. But I really, really buy into, we're working on a paper right now about the overall impacts, not just what I presented about these ventures, of these challenge models, right? You might have heard of hackathons, right? So we're using doppelganger challenges as our example. So what's fun, right? One of the impacts is engineering students. Like me, as I was telling Julio, really bad. Like I was an engineer, right? I was horrible. I almost got kicked out, right? And it was the same reason. I was bored. Like, why am I studying this? Right? I was in the military, so it was an academy. I had to, at least I had a job, right? But for the most part, why does this matter? And one of the things we found, right, in some of these universities that aren't Julio's alma mater, MIT, right, a lot of the students are not from the US. Generally speaking, they're from India or China, right? They're great students, amazing students. They study, they know these things. And so you had a lot of these universities where the people who were born in the US were doing horribly. And then the doppelganger challenges came. We can build robots. Oh, I guess I have to learn this sort of electrical engineering things, right? So it actually motivated them and gave them purpose to study what they were supposed to be studying. And in the words, and by the way, this is an Indian professor who is in Louisiana at a non-MIT university, right? He said, yeah, those white kids, they just want to drink beer and build robots, right? Another anecdote. I used to work in Singapore, and there's a guy named Philip Yo. He was one of the engineers or architects of the Singaporean economy. He's an amazing guy, like one of my mentors. He told me, in Singapore, we have A students, best students in the world. And I hate it. I'm like, what? He's like, they don't do anything. They just study, right? And he's like, what you need is a C+ student. He's like, those are the people that change the world, right? Steve Jobs was a C+ student, right? But the point is like your point, how do I turn this boring academic stuff that Sheldon is good at into changing the world? And you do it first by starting at a basic level. We do a very poor job of that, right? Ironically, we could do a really great job of this. So.
Hi, my name is Alejandra. And first of all, I want to thank you because I come from a scientific career. I did my PhD and my postdoc. And then I moved into the biotech company. But that transition was very difficult to me. I went through that crisis you mentioned, And in 10 years of career in science, then I discovered technology transfer. It's the first time that I am in an audience where this message is shared, the crisis that people go through when you are doing science. And so thank you for mentioning that. I was thinking, and it makes a lot of sense to me and motivates me. In my work, I try to make academics' life easier because I know what it is to be on the other side. So I was wondering, how can I make postdoc students' life easier? You know, how can I join, or how can we create a program where these people that are so talented and interested and motivated and can create things from nothing, because you have to solve many things without money or without resources. So you have communicational skills too. You develop that besides science. How can we create a program where you can maintain these people and make and help other teams, for example, in innovation? Have you done something like that in Georgia Tech?
Thank you so much for this question, because now we're really getting into the details, which is where my heart is, right? So, so one of the things we did in I-Corps, sorry, at MIT, right? But I'm actually doing more in non-big name schools than I am at the big name schools, right? But what we were able to do in 2017 with some money was buy out postdoc time 1 day a week. And it made such a difference, right? That you take that 1 day a week and they're focusing on projects that are external to the university. It could be commercial, it could be social, but it's really a process of socializing them into other walks of life. That's the MIT version. That's the expensive version, right? The inexpensive version, which I'm working on now, and ironically not at Georgia Tech, but a place called Boise State, which has 30 postdocs. It's a tiny school relative to Georgia Tech or MIT, right? What we're doing is we're using this sort of lean venture, lean launch methodology, but we're applying it to their careers, right? And we're doing it in the sense of like an executive, I mean, it's free, but it's like an executive workshop, right? It's a 1-month program, it's part-time, and they have to basically create, sorry, let me back up. So the challenge in a lot of places is, you know, postdocs or my students in public policy don't have any experience in creating something that's not academic, right? They're not building a prototype of a phone, right? They're not building a prototype of a wallet. So what we have them do is create something in a few hours that relates to an alternative path, right? An alternative self, an alternative career. And then they have to go out and test that. So they're having to think of something and create something very, very quickly. You're not going to be an academic scientist. Where's you going to be? And you have to be able to use some of the skills that you've developed, right? And it's a pilot, but it like changes their life, right? Basically, because they're starting to network, they're getting confidence. They need a lot of coaching, right? They need a lot of help to be social. Where do I start? We give them premium LinkedIn accounts, right? They learn how to stalk positively, right? That's what we did. Like I'm a part of a startup, like cold calls, right? All right, we think this is a good fit for our product. Hey, can you spend 30 minutes of us? It's a 0.01 hit rate, right? Go experience that. Like I did that for our startup. You go do that for your career. Guess what? People were actually kind of nice to these poor folks, right? To your point. But we're still tweaking it. But this is, to me, this is such an important opportunity. And what I was talking about earlier, there's no space for people to do this. And then the mentoring. What does this mean for my career? Because I have to go back to my lab, right? So we get external people and very intentionally that aren't old white men, right? That help these individuals. They're often young, they're often successful, but they're not academics. Some of them are former postdocs. How do you provide coaching? And more importantly, that emotional support. That's what we never talk about in tech transfer is emotional support, right? So how do we do that with these folks? That's the short-term solution that we're working on.
Bueno, vamos a dar un aplauso a Chris por esta presentación. Muchas gracias.
Y gracias por inglés.
Todos hicimos un esfuerzo. Muchas gracias, Chris. Muchas gracias a todos los que participaron en esta conversación. Vamos a compartirles la presentación, si podemos. Sí, podemos compartir la presentación que Chris hizo hoy en esta jornada. También vamos a compartir tu correo electrónico por si quieren mantener la conversación. Yo creo que todo lo que surge en esta conversación nos va a servir mucho en el trabajo que hacemos, tanto nosotros, nuestros roles de gestores, como también a los académicos que están explorando estas posibilidades de emprender. Así que muchas gracias a todos y les deseamos una buena jornada.
Gracias.